How's everyone? Okay. We're gonna get this right. Okay. Yes. My name is Joseph McGill. I am the executive director of the Slave Dwelling Project. How's everyone? Good. Oh, you look great. I think I know some of you. For those of you who I've met before, please raise your hand. I see a few hands. I do know some of you, because some of you look familiar. All right, so I've got here a note. I got a note of your purpose. Let me just read what I got in front of me here. It says event objective. See, the conference. Says the conference goal and objective are to provide educational programming on historic preservation that encourages best practices, promote collaboration, raise awareness on current topics in the field, benefits of preservation. All right, guys. Slave Dwelling Project. I see the name of your conference here is Pillars of Preservation Supporting a Stronger Kentucky. I've been around the state. I've been to lots of places around the state, and you guys are doing a great job. I hope that most of you are enjoying yourselves here at this conference and are prepared for some of the things that I'm about to tell you. About the challenges that are out there and ways that not only I've been overcoming some of those challenges, but hopefully encourage you to do some of the same. All right, folks, slave dwelling project. A very simple concept. We find slave dwellings wherever they are in the United States, and we spend nights in those dwellings. And we do that for several reasons. The main reason is because of reasons like this. Anybody recognize that particular house? That's Monticello. If I got the right house, where that's it. That's Monticello. I see all men are created equal, but 3/5 is a fraction. Why is it? I did not learn that Thomas Jefferson enslaved 600 people. And when I say I did not learn that, I'm talking about in my formative years. When I was being educated, even beyond high school, even through college, I did not learn that Thomas Jefferson enslaved 600 people. And then, of course, there's the Sally Hemings story. I have no clue about all that. But I do recall that, once upon a time, there was this pushback in our lifetime, maybe about 10 years ago, where the DNA proved that Sally Hemings did have children by Mr. Thomas Jefferson. And that convinced me that, something was wrong with the history that we learned, especially the history that I learned in high school, that made me think that my enslaved ancestors were happy to be enslaved and that the people enslaving them were benevolent. Because none of that was true. Now, it took me getting a job, summer job, when I was in college, South Carolina State University, where I graduated with an English degree. It took me being hired there during the summer and doing the research that was necessary to be a park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument to know that what I was taught was not real. Because as I did that research, capable of standing before an audience that I knew would challenge a young black man standing before them, telling them about the start of the Civil War, I had to be ready. So in getting ready is when I found out that our educational system was flawed. So be careful what you ask for. Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, where I was once employed up until January of 2023. I was that frontline person talking about slavery at this place. And the number one question that I got when I was working at this site was, were the Draytons, that's D-R-A-Y-T-O-N, because they were the enslaved family that owned Magnolia Plantation Gardens. The number one question that I got was, well, were they good slave owners? Now, I would guarantee you go to any plantation, that would be the number one question that one would be asked. If you're from line, that would be your number, I guarantee you that. Because that's what they're looking for. And they want you to say yes. But when they encountered me, you didn't get that yes that they were looking for. And I would tell them the truth about the enslavement that went on in that place. But let's go back a little further than me working there. Because prior to me working there, I was working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Beautiful organization. And my hours got reduced. And because my hours got reduced, I had to find something to compensate. Well, I was contemplating two things to do because I was becoming more aware of the Green Book. And for those of you who are unaware about the Green Book, you know, once upon a time, we as black folks trying to get from point A to point B was a challenge. We had to know the places along the way that would accommodate us, because not every place would. So I knew in my mind that there were still people alive, and still today, people alive who experienced that, the content of the Green Book and what that brought. We had to know that we couldn't go to a particular beach. I'm from South Carolina. In my younger days, Myrtle Beach was off limits to us. So there was Atlantic Beach, then in Charleston, South Carolina, there was Mosquito Beach, and other beaches and places that we could actually be accommodated. So, Magnolia Plantation was restoring these cabins, and I was a part of the team that was evaluating the work that was being done to these cabins. And I uttered out loud, if these cabins are finished, when these cabins are finished, I would like to spend a night in one of these cabins. Well, somebody heard me. Somebody heard me and took it up to chain of command, and the executive director at the time, Tom Johnson, God rest his soul, said yes. And I thought, well, if he said yes, maybe I should consult with your counterpart, the State Historic Preservation Office, because I needed a list of places to apply this crazy idea of sleeping in slave dwellings just to bring attention to these slave dwellings. Because if we bring attention to the slave dwellings, then we can then bring attention to the people who live in those places. And then we would be able to focus on not only the nice beautiful big house that people come to these places to see, but we can also focus on these dwellings here. Because without these dwellings and the people who live in them and their stolen labor, then that nice beautiful big house would not be. So, I got that list from the State Historic Preservation Office, and I started making phone calls. I explained to them this crazy idea in my head. And then I would complete my call, my request, and then there would be this awkward pause. Rightfully so, because if you got such a call from someone requesting to come spend the night in your slave dwelling, you have to think about that. Because there was a lot of things to think about back then. You know, was this guy looking for treasures? Was he looking for ghosts? Reparations? It was none of that. It was all about bringing attention to these places, because in these places is where the people of whom I derive my DNA were associated with. Or that nice beautiful big house that people were going to see, who built that? You know, if you peel back the layers of this nice beautiful big house, and you see those pass marks or those pass marks in those beams, who put them there? Or if this place is made of bricks, and in these bricks are fingerprints, who put them there? Those just wanting their stories to be told. So there I was on this journey, slave glory project. Now I had already experienced my first night in a slave glory McGill plantation. The photograph that I just showed you, my very first night in a slave glory. I woke up the next morning, didn't know where I was, because this was only my second time on this farm. Wasn't that familiar with the farm. Now, before I went to sleep, there was a news crew there, and the cameraman wanted to tell me a story about an experience that he had in South Africa. And this experience was he was in a tent all by himself. And before he went to sleep, he was awoken by a thud on his chest. Well, that thud on his chest was the toe action. So he tells me the story and leaves. One of the employees at Magnolia Plantation, who was in charge of the petting zoo, reminded me that there were alligators on the property. So he tells me the story and he leaves. So now I'm in this place all by myself. Now, on this plantation, there are peacocks. You know peacocks, they make weird sounds, crazy sounds. And they were making these sounds. Also, on the plantation was a wedding, wedding reception. And in the wee hours of the night, this band is playing live music, that bass, that thumping bass. So all these are going on. And now, the band leaves. So now there's a little serenity. But in this serenity are thoughts about the mothers. Because next year was Mother's Day, about 2010, when I was in this space. And I thought about mothers giving birth to children. And the laws of that period stated that although that child was physically and biologically hers, the law said, no, this is mine because you are a child. Not only are you enslaved, but your children and your children's children will be enslaved. And I thought about people wanting to run away and thinking about that environment because they were living in a swamp. The Africans that were brought over to work at rice plantations had to engineer these swamps. And that's the right word, engineer these swamps to be rice fields that made those enslavers the rich people that they were. And I thought about doing that work, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the enslavers. And running away, if you did indeed run away, the best chance was to take to the waterways, because where one plantation ended, another one began. So you're just running from plantation to plantation. So those are the things that I thought about. And also in this space, in this town, one of the cabin that I spent the night in had a very large tree right next to it. And when the wind blew, the limbs of that tree would interact with the roof. So I had to get up about 5 times to verify that that's what I was doing. But eventually I got to sleep. And the next day I woke up, took a walk. Not being familiar with the property, again, only my second time on the property. Ended up in a cemetery. Cemetery where enslaved people are buried. It was an active cemetery up to the 2000s, maybe early 1990s, because you can walk into that cemetery, you see headstones. And then you see that some of the people were born enslaved, but died free. And then where that headstone is, or those headstones are, between that and where the trees start, the tree lines start, where indentions in the earth. So later I learned that just as I talked about those ass marks in the beams, the fingerprints in the bricks, what I was seeing in the earth, those indentions in the earth, and those enslaved people were lucky enough to have been buried in a box. That box eventually gave way. The earth above it formed, and that's another telltale sign of the presence of our enslaved ancestors. And when I saw that, I knew it was for them that I was about opportunity to tell their stories. They were muted. In fact, it became illegal for them to be educated. So I know I was their spokesperson. And then now I'm into this thing called the Slave Dwelling Project. Being employed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation gave me opportunity because I was responsible for the states of Louisiana and Alabama. It's kind of casework was my job responsibilities. I was kind of the front line for everything the National Trust for Historic Preservation would be doing in those states. Now, luckily for me, I traveled a lot with that job. And once they found out that this slave dwelling project was a thing, and it was going to be a thing, it took a while for that. Because, there were those folks on the sideline just kind of waiting me out. They said, just give him a little time. Just give him a little time, and it'll go away. This crazy idea will just go away. But I persisted. And when I was going to Alabama, they said, well, I got this place, a few places that you can add one more day to your trip here to Alabama, in addition to you doing your official duties, you can do this slave dwelling project thing. So they found me this one place. This place here is this old Alabama town, Montgomery, Alabama. And so I looked at the place. And this is one of 4 compartments on in a 2-level brick structure. 2-level brick structure. That's not a cabin. So I had to immediately change the name of what I was originally calling it, the State Cabin Project, because again, I was going by what I was taught. It was cabins. It is in a plantation in a southern state. That's it. That was my limited knowledge of slavery. But then I saw that. I said, no, cabins are more than just, places that enslaved people live were more than just cabins, because that's certainly not. So I changed the name to the Slave Dwelling Project, because it's all encompassing. And now, because it's a slave dwelling project, now I can sleep in the big house. Because they slept there too. I had one case where Clemson University, where my daughter graduated from, we were doing the tour. Kids, you guys go on those tours with your children who have to choose where they're going to go to college. So there I was with my daughter on that particular tour, and they were talking about Clemson University. They didn't say anything about Benjamin Pitchfork children. They didn't say anything about this being a former plantation. They didn't say anything about convict labor. They didn't say anything about that house on that campus that once belonged to John C. Calhoun. If they said anything about it, they put it in a favorable light. But here's what I learned about one of those places, that place in John C. Calhoun's mansion that's now on the campus of Clemson University. In that space, the enslaved person that was taking care of someone who was infirm in that house would form a pallet, a place to sleep, right outside the door of that person that they were taking care of. Well, tied to that enslaved person's wrist was a string. The other end of that string was tied to where that infirm person was inside that room. If that enslaved person, that infirm person, needed action during the night, he or she wakes up pulling that string, and then that enslaved person goes into action. So that also gave me that opportunity to speak in these big houses, because enslaved people stepped in these big houses also. But it also allowed me to do this. When I first started 15 years ago, I would go to these sites, and the first thing that the host would want to show me was the big house. So I resisted. I stopped going in the big house. And in fact, I got upset that that's all that they wanted to show me. But here's what I learned. I learned that I was being selfish. Because in the big house, you get to interpret spatial segregation. So the next time you go to one of these nice, beautiful big house, and you see the nice staircase that gives access to the invited guests, look for a second set of stairs, because it's that second set of stairs that gives you the indication that in this space is where enslaved people interacted within that space. And so the racism was designed. It was in the architecture of that period. Now, that kind of evolved into public buildings, municipality, or not, it could be something, or then it graduated or evolved into something even more simple than that. You know, a sign, whites only, blacks only. We serve blacks, carry out only. All those things were going on inside these spaces. So that was opportunity to actually interpret these spaces. So my point is, enslaved people live in these big houses also. And a lot of times, these slave dwellings that we look for are not there for various reasons. Kind of like this. When O.J. Simpson was going through what he went through, and was accused of taking out his wife and the delivery person, when all that went away and it was settled, there was a house. There was that house where that happened. Somebody acquired that house for the sole purpose of tearing it down, because they didn't want that memory to stay amongst us in a building. So I kind of applied that same concept to slave dwellings. Some of these slave dwellings are no longer on this earth because some folks think that way or thought that way. Just let it go away, whether it be demolition by neglect, whether it, Mother Nature may have taken these places out. Or some people don't want to pay taxes on buildings that they don't use. Those are, legitimate reasons. But to get rid of them because you don't want to interpret that element of history, I've got a problem with it. This thing says spin. Okay, you got it on screen. I'm just a little too much for it. This thing is going in circles here, but you see the picture there. Okay. So northern state. Anybody here from a northern state? Nobody? Okay, where are you from?
Ohio, North Central Ohio.
Ohio.
You said northern, right?
Okay, yeah. New York, that's the state of it. Because Ohio is a little hard to deal with. So Ohio, when it came to become a state in 1804, they had to deal with the slavery thing. That was a period in history where when you entered the Union, you had to deal with the slavery thing, whether you became a slave state or not. You still had to deal with it. And Ohio decided that, well, you can be free, but be free somewhere else. Just keep it moving. But New York, where's New York? New York. So New York abolished slavery in, 1799 on paper. Last person freed in New York was 1827. In 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. When South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th of 1860, New York considered seceding also because of their financial investment in the institution of slavery. So the first place I stayed, the first northern state that I spent the night in a slave cabin, was this place. This is Clifton, Clyde, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And that's a National Trust for Historic Preservation site. And because it is, I got an invitation to spend the night in that site because they had come across information that revealed that slavery existed in that space. But instead of doing what a lot of organizations were doing at that time, just sweeping that kind of information under the rug, saying that it never existed, they took ownership of that information, of that research. Not only did they take ownership of that research, they started involving the community. They wanted the community to have input on what they should do with this information. And because I was doing what I was doing, they brought me in for some of these workshops to help explain what these enslaved people were doing in that space. they implemented their plan, and it meant that they had to fire some folks. Because, you know, those people were there for so long, they were so used to telling that story that it did not include the enslaved people. And to include the enslaved people, it was going against their beliefs and what they were taught. So they couldn't, they managed not to still be employed there for that purpose. But this particular gentleman, Mr. Chu, C-H-W was his last name. He was a lawyer, and he also owned plantations in the South. So he was, he was playing both sides of the issue. Now, I don't know if he was a part of that crew that, helped Georgetown remain solvent. You know, once upon a time, Georgetown University almost went under. But then the trustees got together and donated enslaved people who were sold to New Orleans to keep Georgetown University afloat. Hey, everybody, it's written. I was about to ask you guys what it is. It's right there, my name. So presidential sites. I've stayed on presidential sites. 12 of our former presidents enslaved people. And you might be surprised that one of those 12 was Ulysses S. Grant. He came to own people through his wife, becoming married to his wife. And he did indeed free this person, manumit this person. But he is still in that list of 12. Let's see, 41 signs of our Constitution, 41 signs of our Declaration of Independence, enslaved people, 25 signs of our Constitution, enslaved people. But that right there, McGill, I've spent a few nights in those cabins. In fact, if you visit McGill and you go into one of those cabins, you'll see a larger-than-life image of me. So next time you go to McGill, look for that. But it's, I almost got into fistfights when I talk about our enslaving forefathers. I recall one time after the presentation, this guy named King got in my face because I talked about Thomas Jefferson enslaving people, only 600 people in the Sally Hemings portion of his life, and this guy wanted to really fight. Now, it hasn't led to a fight yet, not yet. So that's a good thing. But it's good to know I can go into these places and talk about these enslavers. I think in the manner that they should be talked about. If we're going to be inclusive, we got to tell the whole story, not just the comparable parts of those stories. Let's see, categories of places to stay. Presidential sites I just talked about. Institutions of higher learning. Yeah, a lot of institutions of higher learning owe their existence to enslaved people. The state of South Carolina, good example. Furman University, I don't know what that's Furman University. It's in Greenville, South Carolina. Well, the founder of Furman University was a Baptist preacher, and he enslaved people. Let's see, we talked about Clemson University. University of South Carolina has a slave dwelling right behind the president's house. University of Alabama have 2 slave dwellings on it. Francis Marion University, they also in South Carolina, slave dwellings. And I only name those because I made a request to sleep in these places, and those requests were denied. So I like putting them out on Front Street when I can. But I have stayed at lots of universities. University of Virginia, I spent the night there. Let's see. Yeah, a few institutions of higher learning where I've gone to stay. National Park Service. National Park Service was a tough nut to crack. But when I did, now I have stayed at a few National Park Service sites. I think my first National Park Service site was in the state of Louisiana, a place called Magnolia Plantation. I stayed at Kingsley Plantation in Jacksonville, South Carolina. Kingsley Plantation is interesting because there was a black female enslaver there who was married to the enslaver. Yes, they were married. They had a bond, and they had children. And they first told me, no, you can't stay here. But they eventually came around, and I did have a sleepover at the National Park Service. It's become a challenge again, but we'll talk more about that as we progress in this presentation. So yeah, there are all kinds of categories of places. So some of these places are ready for prime time. You know, you can visit and they're ready for you to come visit these slave clubs. That's lovely. Locust Grove. Kentucky was a tough nut to crack. I've stayed in 25 states where slave dwellings are. And Kentucky was number 25. Which means that it came around last in my method of doing things. And see that conversation, we're having a conversation, campfire conversation. And that's an indication that it's more now than just sleeping in slave dwellings. Sleeping in slave dwellings is easy. You know, I do it all. Although I chickened out last night, that's another story. we can talk about that later. So right there at Locust Grove. So the slave dwelling project evolved into this thing that's now more than just sleep. We have campfire conversations. Now guys, we talk about things. We talk about things that people don't usually talk about amongst people who don't look and think like that. We talk about white privilege, white supremacy, historical trauma, Confederate monuments, should they stay, should they go? Weddings on plantations. The black folks, we got an issue with that. Well, most black folks, we have an issue with that. And of course now the elephant in the room is, critical race theory, anti-critical race theory, anti-woke, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now they got a new name for all this. They call it improper ideology. So, we talk about all that around these campfires. So now we do this. And the reason I also want to point out Locust Grove is that these conversations usually last about 2 hours. So I found myself into the third hour with the potential of going to the fourth hour because the conversation just got that interesting and that intense. We talked about Lewis and Clark and all that was involved with Lewis and Clark and everything involved with Locust Grove. Talk about urban because hey, this is Kentucky. And then once that got cracked, we can't stop. Some of you may recognize any of those people in that particular photograph. I see that's Shirley Harmon, Teresa Lee, and Kathy. Anybody know any of those people? I see some hands going up there. Good folks. Great folks. So they came up with this idea that, we want to go beyond just the physical building. We want to talk about the people, not only the enslavers, but we want to talk about the people who were enslaved. We want to give them names if they don't have names. We want to respect them. We want to be their voice. So they called on me to be a part of organizing all that. Not only have we organized it, I've been to Newport quite a few times just to deal with the slavery issue at those particular sites. The place there on the right is Farmington. And I do believe Abraham Lincoln is associated with Farmington. See, Camp Nelson, right here in Kentucky, like I said, I did that last year, I believe, because I'm also a Civil War reenactor. So they called on my services as a Civil War reenactor because Camp Nelson was one of those recruiting places for black soldiers that would serve for the Union during the Civil War. So it's got quite a history. So I, along with some of my reenactors, some of my living historians, went to Camp Nelson and did a beautiful program. And that particular site is doing a great job. Now, I don't know how they're faring now with all this coming out of Washington, D.C., and the fact that they are a national site. Now, the place on the right is Ashland. Yeah, my experience there was not that great. But, you know, they are putting forth that effort. They want to do the right thing. There's some barriers in the way of them doing the right thing. But the thought is there. And if they invite me back, I'll go back. But I know the slave dwellings are not there. The place where the slave dwellings were, they now have a formal garden in that space. And, you know, you can talk about that. But you certainly need to talk about why that those slave cabins are not there anymore. So, yeah. Uncomfortable. So, the challenge that we are facing today is what we are dealing with, and how what we do is classified as improper ideology. All that we have been doing, the State Building Project, you as preservationists, is now being challenged. And some of you might be tied into federal money, INLS, National Endowment for the Humanities, and National Endowment for the Arts. I would wager that this would probably be a larger group of people, but because they're so tied into that federal money, they have to find that money elsewhere that would have paid for them to be here. So that's a strong possibility. I put that out there. But for the State Building Project, it's business as usual. You know, when I started this thing 15 years ago, it was because what's so prominent now, and more people are more aware of the challenges of disseminating this type of history to the public, is classified as teaching young kids to hate themselves in America. Now, how could that be when you're just disseminating facts? So that is the challenge. That's what makes this, what we do, uncomfortable. But it's what the Slave Dwelling Project does. It's what the Slave Dwelling Project will continue to do. We kind of look at it like what happened, you know, with the with Baker's Castle. Stayed there a few times. Baker's Castle. One time I stayed at Baker's Castle with a group of young kids from Wisconsin, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In fact, I'm going to be hooking up with this same teacher later on this month. They're coming to Charleston. We meet around the U.S. and we sleep in slave dwellings about once a year. Well, they're coming to Charleston this year. Make it easier for me. So we went on a tour before we had the conversation. We went on a tour of Nat Turner's revolt. So in the conversation that night, the conversation was, well, Joe, if you were alive during that period, would you have come out with Nat Turner? And my answer was yes. And one of the teachers got upset at my answer. He said, but no, he was killing women and children. I said, well, yeah, you're right. But look at this. If you are being operated on, if you have cancer, right? And you're being operated on, and that doctor goes, performs surgery on you to go in and get that cancer, you want that whole cancer removed, not heart surgery. So my point was this: chattel slavery. Not only are you enslaved, but your children and your children's children will be enslaved. Well, that applies the other way also. Not only are you enslaved, you're going to pass that on and on and on and on. Although some enslavers had in their will that upon my death, well, this person should be free. All of enslaved people will be free. Well, somebody who's still alive is going to have to carry that out. If somebody who's still alive, maybe who's in possession of that will, might say, well, wait a minute. My opportunity to benefit from stealing the labor of these people are not going to exist if you carry out this will. you know, you gotta think about, that's why my answer was what it was to that gentleman in that moment at that time. But the big rebellion, when you think about it also, is, you know, the haves versus the have-nots. So if we can get that thought process amongst all the have-nots, I think, you know, we will be in a better place. And there's the book. Sleeping with the Ancestors. So, the book is co-written by Mr. Herb Frazier. Herb Frazier is 4 times published. 1 time published. This book. So here's what you got to do. How many in this room are published? I see a few hands. Nothing. Are you like the only person? Were there other people involved in what you published? By yourself? More power to you. So, see, I don't have those skills that you have. And I know that. But in knowing that, I also have to know that I have to dial back my ego. Because I'm trusting this person with my idea. But I need a person who can make it flourish. You know, I'm a kind of a matter-of-fact person. When I started sleeping in these slave dwellings, I would write a blog. And it took a lot for me just to write a blog. In fact, my co-worker at the time, Tanya Bowers, she said, Joe, you got a good idea. But it's got to be more than about you. It's got to be more than just satisfying your curiosity. You got to be able to project. So you need to write a blog every time you stay in one of these places. But I said, I'm not like that. That's not what I do. She said, well, just try writing 500 words. So I went along kicking and screaming, writing these 500 words. And it got so good to me that I blew way past 500 words. And it's a good thing that I did. Because it was those blogs that will appear, the content of some of those blogs that appear in a lot of what this book is right now. So we did manage to be successful in that. And I think this might be the last slide we see. Okay, so let me tell you what my biggest challenge is at this very moment. And that is the last slide. So if you guys want to keep in contact with me, the Slave Dwelling Project. You know you young minds do. You can access the Slave Dwelling Project through any of those means. And for some of you TikTokers out there, the younger minds, I am on TikTok. In fact, I just did a TikTok yesterday, but since coming here. So if you would access that, I would be appreciative if you would do just that. So here's my biggest challenge, my most immediate challenge. I got to be on a phone call tomorrow with the South Carolina 250th Commission. They're going to decide if they're going to grant the Slave Dwelling Project the money that we request for our 9th conference. Because in addition to all that I told you that we do, sleeping in slave cabins, the campfire conversations, the living history that we do, we also do conferences. We've done 8 so far. Next year will be 9. And because it's the 250th anniversary of the United States not being ruled by king, not being ruled by a king, we're going to concentrate next year's conference on the 250th anniversary of our independence. Now, what kind of government we're going to be commemorating? I don't know. You know, are we still that republic that we proclaimed ourselves to be? We're going to deal with all those things at the conference. So, in my first round with the commission, of course they questioned me, due diligence and all that. How do you plan to make this work? And well, tomorrow they're going to make a decision. And in this first round of questioning by them, they asked if I knew who was the librarian that just got fired. What's her name?
Carla Hagen.
Carla. They said, well, do you know her? And I shamefully say, well, I did it. Not at that time. They said, I said, no, I don't know. I said, is she keynote speaking material? They said, yeah, she is keynote speaking material. And then a few days later, she was fired. She was out. So if they tell me tomorrow that they're going to grant the money that we're asking for, well, that person who asked that question about the lady who was fired, I'm hoping that she is a part of this discussion tomorrow who's going to say yes. Because if they say yes, I want to, as soon as possible, contact her. Because I think she would make a great keynote speaker to encapsulate all that we're dealing with now as a nation. So wish us the best. Keep your fingers crossed, because that's our biggest opportunity. I think I was using the wrong word. It's our biggest opportunity, not a challenge. And yes, so that is the last slide. So I'm going to yield right now to our host to see if there's time for Q&A, at least questions. I'll try to answer them. So host?
Yes, you have time.
Yes. And I don't know why you can pass this mic, or is there another mic? You guys project well.
Okay, any questions for Mr. McGill?
Hey, Joe. When you talk about this and you have objections from people, because I follow you on Facebook and some of the stories you have about people pushing back, how do you handle that? You know, you're just telling them history and they don't like it. So what are the common pushbacks and how do you handle it?
So luckily for me, I have a sense of humor. It takes that. But because, you know, as I stated, you know, I've been at this thing now, well, pretty much all my life, but more particularly as a safeguarding project for the last 15 years. So a lot of what people are now experiencing in abundance with the pushback to this history, giving it a term, improper ideology, and all of that. I got some pretty good comebacks, because I think one of the most common pushback that I get is, well, you talk about slavery, you talk about all these negative things happening to black folks. They were all done by Democrats. That's what I hear. Then, you know when I come back to that? I said, well, Democrat or Republican, they were all white. And that quells that argument. And again, they're the ones who want to try their best to find good slave owners. And I have to go throughout the details of enslaving people, and the fact that these folks had no right. They couldn't own property. The women could be taken advantage of with no retaliation by the men. Men could not, defend their women of that period. But I think the best thing is the fact that I've been at this thing for a while. I think the biggest challenge for me was when I started 15 years ago. I got this one comment that said, if you want to get in contact with your ancestors, then you should go visit the ape section at the zoo. Now that was harsh. That was harsh. Now if I was thin-skinned, had I not had that experience I had at the time, 6 years in the military, and not being afraid of the unknown, I would have said, I'm done with this. Well, I'm not going to subject myself to all this. But because I was 2 weeks out of high school and now in the Air Force, and having to grow up quickly in the Air Force to cope with being in the Air Force, and knowing that there were folks who didn't look and think like me, and knowing that I couldn't paint everybody with one brush, and having to give everybody an opportunity to prove themselves, then that prepared me for that moment. And because I was prepared for that moment, you know, the stuff they throw at me now is really nothing. But it takes that. It takes a strong person.
Any other questions?
So where did you learn your ability to observe and learn and forgiveness? Was it from your mom, your dad, a relative? Where did you learn that? You don't just walk into this role having had some learning as a young man.
Yeah. Where did I learn forgiveness? Yeah, my mom was very, very, very instrumental in that. And I read a little bit about that in the book. I didn't get that from my father because my father had issues. But yeah, certainly my mom. And I was quite religious during that period in time. I went through two transitions in my religious upbringing. Starting out very young as Catholic. So it's still a lot of doing. Better quit making religious jokes. And then I went from there to Methodist. So having that upbringing, being brought up in the church, it teaches, instills forgiveness. So that was very, very important to the process. And again, I talked about the Air Force experience already, and having to, have that ability to give everybody an opportunity to be a part of your life. Because you depended on people who didn't look and think like you in a military situation. You could be on a fire team. I was in the Air Force security policeman. And we had four-man teams of people, what we call a fire team. Machine gunner, M16, grenade launcher. And, we had all of that. And who were you going to be teamed up with? You had no clue. Sometimes until you got on the team. But you got to learn to trust those people with your lives. So that was a big part of it also.
So you made some comment in your talk that I think you said you chickened out or you freaked out last night. You want to share that story with us?
So yeah, last night. So we're going to be going to Dinsmore, right? Some of you, I'm not there, I don't think all of you do. So this is my first gig that I've done since I'm now part of the agency. So, and my host made it very clear that dealing with agents is not quite like dealing with the subject directly. And in doing sleepovers, I expect others to share that experience with me, because the book is written. That's proven that I can sleep in places. But now, if somebody wants that experience, I want somebody there to share that experience with, because I've had those experiences. And I know there'll be more experiences, but I didn't have any volunteers last night. And then, as we went to the place and continued to go to the place, and the place became more desolate, and the place became more, I said, and then at the time that we were doing the exploration, it was raining, and we were looking at the forecast, and it was saying, well, there's going to be more of this tonight, with a little thunder thrown in the mix. And I was going to be there by myself, and I just chickened out. It was kind of like, and I've done that very rare times in the process of sleeping in state dwellings. One state dwelling I was supposed to sleep in, the condition was so poor that a good gust of wind could come and collapse that place around me. I didn't sleep in that one. I slept on the porch of a big house instead. Stray cat. So that was interesting. But there are very few that are in my experience that I have to say no to. But last night I was probably say number 2. No, it was a place in North Carolina. So it's good. Similar to what I experienced last night. I went there expecting that I would be joined by others, and they said, well, we'll stay with you for the campfire conversation, and we're out of here. So I declined to stay at that one also. Now, the kind of safe dwellings that scare me the most are the ones with dirt floors. You know, creepy crawlies and all that. But my co-author said, you know, it might be a little more to it than that. It might be that in that earth, there's DNA, the presence of our enslaved ancestors. Maybe that's what scares you. Because a lot of people ask me the question, well, are you attempting to commune with the ancestors? And my answer to that is no. Because that's a lot there, guys. That's a lot. That's heavy. I want to deal with the physical. I want to deal with what I have control of. Now, I know their intent to warn me, if it was possible, would be all possible. But there might be one pissed off person out there.